The world never expected it to come to this. For years, the tension between Drake and Kendrick Lamar simmered beneath the surface of hip-hop like a dormant volcano, slowly gathering pressure. Inching toward the explosion everyone feared, but no one could truly imagine. Their rivalry had always lived in lyrics, subliminals, cryptic interviews, and crowd-splitting fan debates. It was entertainment. Until the night, everything changed. What began as a lyrical war morphed into something darker, something no one in the industry could walk away from untouched. And today, for the first time, the world is seeing the consequences spill into a courtroom where Drake, one of the biggest artists on the planet, sits stone-faced as the judge prepares to read a sentence that would shake global music culture to its core. Reporters crowd the hallway. Fans outside scream his name. Cameras flash from every direction as the courthouse doors open, revealing a scene no one ever imagined they'd witness. This wasn't an album rollout or a PR stunt. This was the end of an era. The prosecution claims Drake crossed a line, planning, financing, and attempting to execute an attack on Kendrick Lamar after their beef escalated to its breaking point. They say the evidence is undeniable. They say the intent was crystal clear. They say Drake wanted Kendrick gone. Inside the courtroom, Kendrick's family sits in the front row, faces tense, eyes locked on the man they once collaborated with. A man who, according to the state's allegations, turned into something unrecognizable under pressure, competition, and pride. Kendrick himself hasn't spoken publicly throughout the trial, but the silence itself became its own roar, one that echoed through the culture louder than any diss track. Drake, meanwhile, sits with a quiet stillness that no one can decode. Is it regret, frustration, shock, or is it the calm before the biggest storm of his career breaks apart everything he built? Security flanks him on both sides. His team looks helpless. His mother wipes tears that she tries hard not to show. For weeks, rumors swirled. Hidden recordings, private conversations leaked, eyewitnesses stepping forward. Each day of the trial pushed the story closer to the edge. And now, finally, the world is about to hear the final verdict. This is the moment hip-hop will never forget, a moment when the world pauses, a moment when fans realize that beef has real consequences, and nobody, not even the biggest superstar in the world, escapes accountability. This is the final chapter in a story that spiraled far beyond music. The judge raises the paper, clears his throat, and the room falls silent, because whatever comes next will change everything. The industry, the culture, and maybe even the future of both artists. This is the day Drake is sentenced for Kendrick Lamar's attempted murder. And this is goodbye forever. The courtroom felt like a world suspended in time, a place where fame, money, and global influence no longer had value. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the gallery was filled with people who'd seen enough already. Reporters scribbling notes with trembling hands, industry figures who had traveled quietly under disguise, and fans who had somehow secured one of the few public seats. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the man sitting at the defense table. A man who had spent more than a decade sitting atop the industry with a confidence no one dared challenge publicly. Today, that confidence was gone. Drake sat rigid, his fingers laced together tightly, his stare frozen on the polished wooden surface beneath him. The weight of the charges hanging over him felt heavier than anything he had faced in music, because this wasn't about charts, awards, or rivals. This was about freedom, and the world was watching. The rivalry between Drake and Kendrick had always been part of hip-hop lore, stretching back to early subliminals, competitive jabs, and fan-fueled debates, but most people assumed it was just that. Competition, something that belonged in the booth, not the streets, something that made hip-hop exciting, not dangerous. But the prosecution argued that Drake's pride, wounded over the years by Kendrick's increasingly sharp criticisms and his rising dominance in the rap landscape, had gradually turned the rivalry into an obsession, one that spiraled into something darker. The first witness called was a former engineer who had once worked closely with Drake's team. He walked to the stand with a nervous stiffness, glancing toward the defense table only once before quickly looking away. Under oath, he told the court about a night months earlier when he had been in a recording studio in Toronto. Drake had been pacing back and forth, headphones off, replaying what the engineer claimed was an unreleased Kendrick verse. The verse allegedly criticized Drake in a way that cut deeper than previous jabs, suggesting manipulative behavior, backdoor industry deals, and a pattern of sabotaging younger artists. and the engineer said Drake looked shaken, then angry. He claimed Drake muttered that Kendrick had crossed a line. Drake's legal team objected repeatedly, arguing the testimony was hearsay, exaggerated, or embellished for attention, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. The engineer insisted he left that night feeling uneasy, sensing something was shifting in Drake's energy. He said it wasn't rage, it was something colder, more calculated, something he couldn't describe but never forgot. Then came the testimony from someone far more damaging to Drake's image, a former associate who claimed they had acted as a middleman between Drake's camp and an unnamed group hired to send a message. The associate was already facing unrelated charges and was offered reduced sentencing for cooperation, which Drake's lawyers used to attack his credibility. But the prosecution presented what they called supporting evidence: text messages, call logs, and financial transfers routed through shell companies linked indirectly to Drake's management circle. Nothing explicitly named Kendrick, but the timing aligned disturbingly with the night Kendrick was attacked outside a private studio in Los Angeles. The details of the attempt were laid out with clinical precision. Kendrick had finished a late-night session and walked toward his vehicle with 2 security guards. The attack was quick. 2 masked individuals approached, one armed. A struggle ensued. One guard was struck but managed to push Kendrick behind a parked SUV. The attackers fled when additional security rounded the corner. Kendrick was shaken but unharmed. In any other case, it might have been brushed off as a robbery attempt, but detectives quickly found inconsistencies. No stolen items, no evidence of escape routes typical for opportunistic crime, and the rental car used in the escape was traced to a company prosecutors argued was part of a network linked to Drake. Inside the courtroom, every detail felt exaggerated by silence. Drake didn't flinch when the footage of the masked men running toward the car was played. He didn't react when the prosecution displayed maps showing the attacker's route. He barely blinked when they described Kendrick's mother sprinting into the hospital to check on her son. His stillness made the entire room uneasy. No emotion, no outrage, no disbelief, just calm. The prosecution's most chilling moment came when they presented a short recording recovered from a phone belonging to one of the alleged middlemen. The audio was grainy, distorted, and nearly drowned by street noise, but a voice that sounded strikingly like Drake's said, "He pushed me too far. Someone needs to remind him who he's dealing with." Drake's lawyers immediately argued it was fabricated, the product of modern audio manipulation. They brought up deepfakes, AI models, and online impersonators, insisting their client had never said such words. But the prosecution had already prepared. They brought in an audio specialist who testified that the vocal signature aligned with Drake's natural speech patterns. The argument wasn't about the clarity, it was about authenticity, and the specialist claimed the recording was real. Fans outside the courthouse erupted when news of the recording leaked. Some insisted it was a setup, others said it was proof the fame had gone to Drake's head. Inside, Kendrick's family sat quietly through every moment, their eyes fixed on Drake. Kendrick himself was not present. The judge ruled his appearance unnecessary unless summoned, but his absence was somehow louder than a statement. It painted him as a man who wanted no part in the spectacle beyond the legal necessity. Near the end of the day, the prosecution called Kendrick's mother to the stand. The courtroom shifted as she approached, her face lined with pain, exhaustion, and disappointment. She spoke softly but firmly, telling the jury how she had once admired Drake, played his music in her home, even prayed for his success when her son was still climbing. She said she never believed their competition could turn dangerous. She looked directly at Drake and asked why the music wasn't enough, why her son had to fear stepping outside a studio. Drake didn't lift his eyes. As court adjourned, the tension didn't ease. People filed out whispering, some shaken, some angry, some confused. Security escorted Drake through a back exit as fans screamed his name from afar. Whatever people believed before the trial, the first full day had cracked the image of invincibility surrounding him. The world now waited for what would come next. The evidence was stacked higher than anyone expected, the testimonies cut deeper, and the silence from Drake grew heavier. And for the first time in his long career, the next move wasn't his to decide. It belonged to the court, the jury, and fate itself. The second day of the trial carried a different kind of tension, one that felt heavier, darker, almost suffocating. Everyone who stepped into the courtroom that morning sensed it instantly. Word had spread overnight about the audio clip allegedly capturing Drake's voice in a moment of quiet fury, and the debate over its authenticity had already divided the internet. Experts appeared on live panels. Fans on both sides argued relentlessly. Journalists speculated that the prosecution had something even more damaging prepared for today, and when the judge entered, the The room grew so silent it felt like every breath was being held at the same time. The prosecution wasted no time. They approached the bench with a small black USB drive labeled only with the date of the incident. The courtroom watched closely as the device was handed to the technician. The judge adjusted his glasses, looking down at the paperwork authorizing its admission. Then he nodded. The technician pressed play. The recording that filled the courtroom wasn't music, wasn't conversation, and wasn't immediately recognizable. It started with the sound of someone breathing heavily, wind distorting the microphone slightly, footsteps scraping against pavement. The audio shifted. A muffled voice whispered, "Is everything set?" Another replied, "We're ready." There was movement. The kind of rustling that suggested someone adjusting clothing or equipment. Then came the voice the prosecution insisted belonged to Drake. This time, it wasn't calm or collected. It carried a strained anger, something thick and sharp. "I told you what I need done. Want your don't leave loose ends." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Drake's legal team shot to their feet, objecting immediately. They argued the audio was a patchwork fabrication, stitched together from other recordings, manipulated to incriminate a global superstar. The prosecution countered with another expert, an acoustic analysis specialist who spent 30 minutes explaining how the vocal inflections, background frequencies, and pattern signatures match natural speech, not AI synthesis. The jury watched a screen displaying waveforms and frequency graphs, absorbing the information with varying expressions of confusion and concern. Meanwhile, Drake sat motionless. No twitch, no frown, no sigh. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, hands clasped the same way they had been since the trial began. Some spectators said he looked cold. Others said he looked terrified but skilled at hiding it. His composure left the courtroom divided on whether it was confidence or numbness. When the audio ended, the prosecution pivoted to witnesses. The first was a man who had been arrested months earlier on unrelated charges but suddenly became central to the case. He claimed he was approached by two individuals offering a significant amount of money for surveillance work. He said he was instructed to monitor Kendrick's studio schedule, note which nights were busiest, and identify the moments when the security presence was the thinnest. He admitted he didn't know at first who he was working for, but later overheard one of the coordinators mention OVO clearance, a phrase that chilled the courtroom when he repeated it. The defense tore into him, accusing him of lying to reduce his sentence. They displayed inconsistencies in his previous statements, but the prosecution countered by presenting financial records showing encrypted transfers to his account from a shell corporation connected to a consulting firm used frequently by major entertainment companies, including those tied to Drake's operations. The next witness was even more alarming. A former security contractor hired for a short-term assignment in Los Angeles. He claimed he initially believed he was part of a high-profile celebrity protection detail. He was told to monitor unfamiliar vehicles around Kendrick's studio and report suspicious activity. But on the night of the attempted attack, he realized he wasn't protecting anyone. He was participating in a setup. He testified that the two masked attackers arrived in a car he had previously seen parked outside Drake's rented Los Angeles residence. He said one of the men made a comment before stepping out. He should have stayed in his lane. The defense objected relentlessly. They pointed out the witness's lack of credentials, accusing him of inventing details to elevate his involvement. They suggested he misinterpreted what he saw, but the prosecutor reminded the jury that the shell company renting the attacker's car was linked directly to individuals in Drake's management circle. The connection wasn't definitive proof, but the implication was powerful. The courtroom wasn't just listening, they were feeling the weight of every word. The tension intensified when the prosecution summoned a medical expert who had examined Kendrick's security guard, the one who took the hit during the attack. The expert detailed the severity of the guard's injuries and emphasized that if he hadn't intercepted the assailant at that moment, Kendrick would have been face to face with an armed attacker. The implication was clear. Someone intended to cause serious harm. With every passing minute, Drake's silence became more unnerving. His attorney leaned in multiple times, whispering strategy, but Drake rarely responded. Some speculated he was instructed to remain stoic. Others believed he wanted to maintain control in a situation in which he had none. Reporters sitting in the back row scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for the world outside. Then came a pivotal moment. The prosecution presented a timeline, a carefully constructed sequence matching phone data, text messages, studio logs, and car movements. Every piece fit like a puzzle sliding into place. The attack, the surveillance, the communication between intermediaries, it all formed an outline of a coordinated effort. Nothing directly tied Drake's hand, but the outline pointed unmistakably toward knowledge, involvement, or at the very least, approval. The defense countered with aggression, trying to dismantle the prosecution's momentum. They introduced character witnesses who spoke about Drake's generosity, discipline, and commitment to his family. They called one of Drake's longtime collaborators, who insisted he was incapable of plotting violence. But character testimonies couldn't erase the recordings or the timeline. They were emotional appeals in the middle of a storm of evidence. The intensity peaked when the prosecution revealed a message allegedly sent by someone in Drake's orbit just hours after the attack. It read, "It's handled." The jury stared at the printed screenshot projected on the wall. Drake's lawyer insisted the message referred to a separate business issue. He argued the wording was ambiguous and misinterpreted, but the timing was devastating. The message was sent only 40 minutes after Kendrick was rushed to safety. As the day neared its end, the judge called for a brief recess. People spilled into the hallway, shaken, overwhelmed, whispering theories and reactions. Some fans defended Drake with unwavering loyalty. Others admitted they didn't know what to believe anymore. The trial wasn't just legal, it was emotional, cultural, and historic. When court resumed, Drake was asked once again if he wished to speak, and once again he declined. The judge nodded, almost studying him as though trying to decipher the motives behind the silence. It was a silence that screamed louder than any denial. The prosecution closed the day by stating they would present their final evidence the following morning. They didn't say what it was, but the confidence in their tone made the room uneasy. Everyone sensed the endgame approaching. When the judge dismissed the court, no one moved immediately. People needed a moment to process, to breathe. Drake was escorted out through a private exit as a crowd outside chanted conflicting messages, some begging for justice, some calling his name in support. And in the middle of that noise, the truth was becoming more undeniable. The image of the invincible superstar had shattered. The case had grown too large, too detailed, too interconnected to ignore. And tomorrow, whatever the prosecution unveiled next, would determine whether the world saw Drake as a wrongfully accused icon, or a man responsible for the darkest twist in modern hip-hop history. The final day of testimony began with an electricity in the courtroom that no one could deny. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder outside, their microphones raised like arrows pointed at the entrance. Fans packed the streets, holding signs, chanting, crying, arguing. Police lined the sidewalks, anticipating a storm no matter how the verdict went. But inside the courtroom, the world narrowed into a still, breathless chamber where one man's future, one man's legacy, and one man's darkest accusation were about to collide. Drake arrived wearing the same expression he had carried for days. Calm but distant, his gaze fixed slightly downward as if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. His legal team hovered close, whispering strategy and reassurance, but he barely nodded. Observers had spent the entire trial analyzing his body language, hoping for hints, guilt, fear, confidence, remorse. But Drake had become unreadable, a quiet figure trapped inside the rolling avalanche of evidence and public fury. The prosecution stood with a confidence that made the room tighten. Their mystery evidence, the piece they promised would shift the entire weight of the trial, was finally ready to be revealed. The lead prosecutor stepped forward holding a thin stack of documents. No theatrics, no grand gestures. Just a quiet announcement that they had obtained a newly authenticated transcript of a conversation extracted from a heavily encrypted voice message recovered off a seized device belonging to one of the alleged middlemen. The courtroom waited, still as stone. The prosecutor began to read. The voice message described frustration, pressure, and a mandate to finish the job before he embarrasses us again. The transcript indicated that the sender discussed someone higher up pushing for results, a phrase the prosecution argued unmistakably pointed toward Drake. The middleman had saved the voicemail but tucked it deep within an encrypted folder. Until yesterday, it had been unreadable. A forensic analyst cracked it overnight. The defense erupted, calling it outrageous, inadmissible, unreliable, yet possibly fabricated within the last 24 hours. They moved to have it dismissed, but the prosecution countered that the metadata confirmed its origin, and the voicemail was discovered weeks ago during the device seizure, only decrypted now. The judge reviewed the paperwork quietly, his brow tense, his eyes scanning line after line. After several long minutes, he looked up and allowed the transcript to be entered. The courtroom exhaled all at once, and the sound rippled through the room like a breaking wave. The prosecution wasn't finished. They played an audio-enhanced version of the voicemail. The voice wasn't Drake's, but the prosecutor emphasized the language, phrases that insiders in the music industry, according to expert witnesses, often use to refer to decisions coming from the highest executive level. When they argued the higher up could only refer to Drake, given the organizational structure of his team. Then came the part that chilled the room. Near the end of the voicemail, the middleman said, "He wants him rattled. He wants him humbled. If it goes further, that's not my call." The prosecutor paused after reading that line, letting the silence extend long enough for every juror to feel the implications. Drake didn't move, didn't blink, didn't shift his gaze. His neutrality had become a shield, a mask, or maybe a prison. The defense countered immediately. They argued the "he" in the voicemail could refer to a publicist, a manager, a producer, any number of people. They suggested it was an internal discussion about business strategy, media competition, or brand positioning. They insisted the prosecution was twisting language, building narratives out of shadows and assumptions. They accused the courts of allowing fame to eclipse facts. But the weight of the prosecution's case wasn't in one piece of evidence. It was in all of them woven together. Recordings, timelines, witnesses, financial transfers, encrypted communications, surveillance logs. None of it was definitive on its own, but together they formed something thick, something undeniable, something that felt like truth, even if no one could touch it. During a midday break, tension spilled into the hallways. Kendrick's family remained silent, guarded by security, their expressions drawn tight. Drake's mother, who had attended every day quietly, wiped her eyes repeatedly, her hands trembling. Outside, the crowd had grown chaotic. Police had barricaded the street, trying to control the swirling mixture of fans, activists, and spectators desperate for an outcome. When court resumed, the judge announced that closing arguments would begin. The prosecution painted Drake as a man whose ego had been bruised by years of lyrical warfare, a man who could not tolerate being overshadowed, a man who allowed pride to twist into obsession until it spilled off the stage and into real life. They didn't claim Drake wielded the weapon. They didn't claim he sent explicit instructions. Instead, they argued he created the environment, the pressure, the expectations that made violence feel like a natural extension of loyalty. The defense countered by reminding the jury that Drake was one of the most targeted figures in entertainment, a man constantly surrounded by opportunists, leakers, impersonators, and disgruntled former employees. They argued this was a circus built on speculation, circumstantial connections, and digital artifacts easily manipulated in an age of technology. They warned the jury not to destroy a man's life based on conjecture. The courtroom grew unbearably tense as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed. People paced. Some prayed. Some wept. Some argued in hushed tones. Drake sat alone with his hands folded, staring at the empty witness stand as though studying the ghosts of every accusation. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip. The judge asked the question the entire world had been waiting for. The foreperson's voice wavered only slightly as they read the words. The jury found Drake guilty of conspiracy in the attempted murder of Kendrick Lamar. The room erupted. Gasps, cries, shouts, people clutching their chests, people covering their mouths, security rushing forward to control the chaos. Drake didn't collapse, didn't shout, didn't react. His eyes closed for a brief moment, almost like he was exhaling years of silence all at once. Then he opened them, calm, steady, resigned. The judge immediately scheduled sentencing for later that afternoon, unwilling to delay what would inevitably become a global spectacle. Hours later, the courtroom filled once again, people trembling as they waited for the final blow. Drake stood as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The judge spoke with a tone both heavy and deliberate. He acknowledged Drake's contributions to music, his philanthropic work, his role as a cultural figure, but he also condemned the abuse of influence, the dangers of unchecked power, and the catastrophic consequences of allowing personal conflict to become orchestrated violence. The sentence was severe. Years behind bars. The words hit the room like a final thunderclap. The world outside roared. Some screamed in anger, some in relief, some simply in disbelief. Drake lowered his head slightly but did not break. As officers stepped forward to escort him out, he turned briefly toward his mother, offering a small nod to comfort her before disappearing behind the door leading away from the courtroom. Kendrick's family embraced one another, their grief and relief intertwined. The judge exited. Reporters rushed out. The courtroom emptied slowly, shaken by the unthinkable reality they had just witnessed. And as news alerts exploded across the globe, One era of hip-hop ended, not with a diss track, not with a scandal, not with a rivalry burned out over time, but with a gavel drop heard around the world. Drake sentenced, goodbye forever. If you made it this far, you already know this story is only getting darker, so before you go, hit that like button so more people see the truth, smash subscribe so you never miss the next twist, and turn on the notification bell because the next update could drop any second. And tell me in the comments, do you think this case is really over? Or is there something even bigger hiding behind the scenes? Your opinion might be the one that changes everything.